Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I've found in my travels. Today it is Short Story Tuesday, and even though I said because I was attending a conference this week I wasn't going to make videos, I've decided to still make a Short Story Tuesday video because short stories are so much fun to read. And today's short story is all about someone giving blood and remembering a friend long past. I am referring to Ulysses by Andrew Milan Milward, which comes from his short story collection, The Agricultural Hall of Fame, which was published in 2012. For those who don't know, Andrew Milward is an American author working at a university in Mississippi. He's won a couple of awards, including, I think, the National Endowment for the Arts, and he's only published 3 books thus far, if Google is correct. It's this one, another short story collection, and then a nonfiction book, I think, which was published in 2019, so I don't really know what Milward has been up to since then, but I presume he's still teaching in Mississippi, so that's interesting. What's also interesting is this is his first piece of fiction that he's gotten published, as far as I can tell, and it's a pretty solid first sort of short story collection. A lot worth talking about in it, but I wanted to focus particularly on the short story Ulysses. So without further ado, let's talk about it. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Ulysses focuses on an unnamed narrator. They are a young adult living in a nearby town to another. It's an unincorporated town or something like that, but it's next to a city called Ulysses. And the narrator is going there to give blood, similar to how their mother gave blood in the past. It's their first time, but they hope to continue to do this into the future. And as they're giving blood, they recall a friend that they knew who was living in the same town, and their name was Ulysses. They noted that Ulysses was a bit of a bigger individual, fat, and they had diabetes, so they had to give themselves regular shots. And they were made fun of for it because of the otherness of having diabetes in this small town. Although the narrator was friends with Ulysses, they also got bullied, but they tried to distance themselves whenever possible. And one of those situations happened when Ulysses was in the bathroom with the narrator. He asked the narrator to give him the shot of insulin, and he was going to do it, but he started crying because he thought of the stress and the pressures from his own life. And when other kids entered the bathroom, presumably bullies, the narrator just ran out and let Ulysses get beat up, presumably. And at that point, the narrator flashes back to the present. They're finishing up their donation, and they're eating snacks in order to keep up their health, or whatever it is that you keep up when after you get blood and you need to drink water or eat sugary treats. I don't exactly know the reason for that. After that, the narrator recalls how Ulysses died their senior year. A bit unclear why he died. He might have committed suicide, or he might have died from the diabetes. It's a bit unclear. But the narrator is sad by this, but he also wants to distance himself again because he doesn't want that sort of otherness applied to him. And so when he gets on the bus one time, the bus driver asks him, what happened to your friend? He usually gets on, but he hasn't been on all week. And the narrator, doesn't really know how to react. And so he merely just says, oh, he wasn't my friend. And he heads to school knowing that he said that. And as the story comes to a close, the narrator flashes back to the present and is leaving the clinic and leaving Ulysses presumably to go back home. And that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there is a little bit worth talking about with Ulysses. One of the main themes that pops up in this short story is that of guilt. The narrator feels somewhat guilty for what happened to their friend. Although they were not the reason for their death, they still feel an immense amount of pressure, and Milward shows us in a number of ways in this story. It's clear that the narrator feels guilty because of the bullying. They didn't bully the kid Ulysses, but they did sort of pass the buck to Ulysses, sort of running away and trying to distance himself so he himself wouldn't get bullied, and that didn't really work. And so there's strength in solidarity rather than strength and sort of scapegoating or anything like that. So unfortunately, the narrator kind of realizes that now, and it's too late for that. There's also a sense of shame that the narrator is dealing with, the shame in the present moment of sort of passing the buck onto Ulysses, but also the shame of having a friend at the time who had a condition like diabetes that made him so vulnerable. And then there's shame from their own family life because, as they note, like their father died, their mother was all alone, so they didn't really have a lot, and so it was a lot for a young adult to deal with, or like a teenager to deal with, and the guilt comes from that, but it also comes from knowing that although his situation was bad, it probably wasn't as bad as Ulysses, and he feels bad for just crying and being like, oh, my life is bad, even though Ulysses seems to have it worse. Although, again, it's not really a competition. Both their situations are pretty unfortunate given what's happening in their lives. But the narrator can't get beyond that. And what's also interesting is that although the narrator probably left the Ulysses area and is living in a nearby town, they seem to come back to the town of Ulysses to give blood in this case, but they might also be doing it for other reasons. And that seems to be a constant reminder of what he did to his friend. And that indicates that he might never have forgiven himself. The narrator is planning to constantly go back to Ulysses because they recognize that that's a really down moment in their life, one of their worst moments, and they haven't forgiven themselves. They haven't come to terms with the loss of their friend, and it's just kind of been on their mind since that moment. Never really addressing that trauma that they might have felt, addressing the depression that they might have spiraled into, and this is representative of that. Now, maybe one day the narrator might move to another town, and that might be them sort of coming to terms with that guilt and forgiving themselves. But here, it's clear that the narrator is in a bad state. Although they appear fine on the outside, they're giving blood, their life seems to be good. There's a lot going on internally for them. And I like how Milward is getting at that, how the guilt can be, not only based on the things that you did, but it could also be reflected in your actions and in the present moment of where you're choosing to live, the physical space that you're in. So I think that's an interesting thing that Milward does here. Another interesting element or idea that Milward is talking about in this story, but also in the other stories in this collection, is that of the theme of the rural life. Of Milward presenting a slice of what it's like in rural areas, or not as deeply condensed urban areas, which is something I have experience with. I grew up in rural Iowa. A lot of what what Milward said here, a lot of what he said in this entire collection is fascinating, because it's like, oh yeah, I definitely remember that. I can sense that that's something that a person might have gone through. And you see a lot of that through the small incorporated towns that he's talking about in the story. For example, like the narrator notes, like they didn't have a school in the town that he lived in because it was so small, so they had to move the school to like a sort of a central location where a bunch of different towns could all come to have a centralized school system with enough students to justify having it open. That's very familiar. My school had to do that when I was a freshman because there just simply weren't enough bodies. They also had to ride the hick bus, another familiar experience for me, basically making them others because they were poor, like country people. They had to ride into the town on a hick bus, basically a way for farmers and the children of farmers to get to school. And then you also see that a little bit with the bullying, because sometimes bullying would be a bit racist or whatnot. In normal places, like people are singled out because of the color of their skin or something like that. But in small rural areas, people are singled out because of their otherness, which is most of the case. But given in larger places, the otherness is the color of your skin. Here, it's more of something so small as to be diabetes. Like, oh, you have to inject yourself with insulin. You're different and therefore worthy of ridicule. Oh, and you're this person's friend. You are also worthy of ridicule. Maybe not a lot of differences because, again, rural areas are homogenous, but Milward is showing that, like, in these small towns, bullying is done by those who just aren't seen as normal. It also seems like, according to Milward, like the rural world, given how little there is there, it makes the guilt more visible. Like, you can't readily escape from it. There's a good quote that I'd like to read to you from this. I wanted to get on the bus and never get off. Just ride forever, flat out leave, watch the squares of country divided by grain elevators and windmills pass outside my window. I slumped into the empty seat and let my body ease into the new space, shaking a little from the bus's trembling idle, waiting for the long ride past miles of short grass prairie to start. And there you see the narrator kind of seeing the world outside, the rural landscape on the way to their school. And again, it's there's nothing there, so you're constantly in your mind thinking about all the things that went wrong, especially with their friend Ulysses. So because there's not a lot in the rural world, you only have yourself, and you can only focus on your traumas or the things that aren't happy, and you're just stewing on the bad in the world. There's also that desire to escape, as you just saw in this quote, which is very familiar, because if you're in a rural area, like, even if you're content there's not a lot to do, and so you feel a desire to just get out and try to find yourself in somewhat of a larger city, somewhere with more to do. There are people who are content living there, but for the most part, there's very few opportunities to get elsewhere. You might not have a lot of money, as the case is for the narrator in this story, to go elsewhere. And you might not have that much communication with the outside world, especially since rural America doesn't have that big of internet opportunities, especially at the time this was written. And this seems to take place in the 90s, judging by how they talk in the story. So even then, there wasn't a lot of communication with the outside world. So there's a sense to escape, but not really an understanding of how to do it in this story. And so you end up stuck in the same place, reliving your worst memories. And that's a very fascinating sort of exploration of the rural experience, according to Milward. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Ulysses by Andrew Milward. Pretty solid short story. It was pretty good. It wasn't, one of the most high caliber short stories that I've read, but I do like what Milward is doing in this one, as well as the other short stories in the collection. I think it's good to seek it out. Maybe find it at your local library. Don't forget to patronize your local libraries, and check it out. It's probably not a purchase, but it is something that's worth finding at your local library. If you read this before, you simply want to comment on something I said here, do so below. Let's have a discussion about this. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this short story or this author if they don't already know. Also, join the Discord if you want to have a chat about other books or movies or stuff like that. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and country roaming travels. Farewell.